broad terms, he is not letting governments off the hook. There was a time when, and you would know this very well, when the whole discussion on corporate responsibility, corporate social responsibility, was focused on corporations, and kind of, the role of states was a backdrop. They were either good or bad, but now they're in the front line too. And I think this is very healthy, because I think it's a bit unfair to expect corporations to take on too much of what is the role of state. And that's again why I thought that the speech of your governor, he was aware that the responsibility that he has is to have the proper enabling environment for the corporate sector. And so, over time, we're going to need both. But I would very much be in tune with what you say about there is also an African way, and nothing in these guidelines should prevent a kind of African way of developing as well, because there are great strengths. There is more solidarity in the African way, both individuals and communities and corporations, solidarity with the wider community in broader services, etc. And nothing in the guidelines cuts against that. But and I think when there are consultations in Africa and conferences, it will be important to assert the importance of bringing out the cultural and experience of African corporations and what they're doing, and build on that.
Thank you. I think the starting point has to be the whole conversation on rule of law, what you talked about, what Ibrahim indicated, because this, the discussion right now about setting standards can only function where you have mature human rights institutions or structures to actually, if not enforce, supervise, not to go to the extreme. And you talked about Liberia improving. I think we have to bear in mind is because those structures now exist. If I use a company like Firestone a few years ago in Liberia, they operated at minimal cost, and human rights abuses were very high because the structures didn't exist. And so when you post-conflict Liberia, where you now have more mature structures, human rights institutions that can actually draw attention to malpractices by corporations, the abuses went down. So the starting point in Africa has to be the rule of law and establishing institutions, human rights or otherwise, that can play a watchdog role. Secondly, I think when we talk about things like this, we really focus on multinationals. But there is a growing, vibrant community of indigenous businesses that are abusing rights. And as we talk as Africans, we have to look at creating that awareness within communities. In the past, discussions on human rights were regarded as separate from business, and they were completely different silos. And so we're talking about integrating, unfriendly partners, and it's going to be very difficult to operationalize what we're discussing, though they're important ideals and that it's very necessary to set standards.
I must say thank you very much for both of the points that you made. I agree very much with what you said about why Liberia is significantly improving, and in particular, you mentioned the example of Firestone. I was actually in Liberia a number of times in recent years because, after all, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was the first woman elected president, and as a former woman president, I'm a good friend and I'm determined that she must show that women can perform very well in that office. But one time when I was there a few years ago, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was traveling to the Firestone company to receive an award from American labor unions for the way in which she had, with her Labour Minister Coffee Woods, renegotiated the concession and dealt with a lot of the bad problems, if you like, in that. And it was not easy. It was a really difficult thing, and it shows real political leadership to be able to do that kind of thing. And it doesn't mean that there are no problems, but at least, as you say, there are very strong standards and strong leadership. I also agree very much that you in this conference need to focus very much on indigenous, on African companies, both here in Nigeria and elsewhere. But you have more expertise, if you like, than I have on that. One suggestion I would make to you, I was very taken by the value of that network meeting in Ghana a few years ago of the UN Global Compact, because it drew in networks from other companies, etc. And I would suggest that it would be a good idea to try to have a network, there are regional network meetings, and there's also an overall network meeting which takes place in different places. I think the last one I was at was in Istanbul, and you had obviously the network there, but you had networks from every region. So sometimes you have regional, African or European or Asian, and sometimes you have international. But if over the coming years Nigeria was to host at least a regional networks, it does two things. It brings the examples from different parts of the continent speaking this. Secondly, it's going to be, back to Wayne's initial question, it's going to be a real discussion about how to align the voluntary, rather soft standards, if I could put it that way, of the Global Compact with the more rigorous standards of the guiding principles, but from a realistic base of doing business, you know, which is, I think, the important testing in practice and sharing experiences in practice. My last remark, and I make this to you in praising you again, you know, I've been to quite a lot of corporate conferences. They're not always as gender balanced as this corporate conference, so I again pay tribute to the fact that there's a very good balance in the room.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, would like you to one more time put your hands together for our keynote speaker, chief host, and at this time would like to request the presence of all our speakers, keynote speaker, our chief host, to please come as we officially launch the journal, which is our CSR files. Public presentation of the journal, which is the CSR files,